What if I told you that you don't need to have the perfect genetics or a magic nose to become a proficient wine taster? In fact, when I was first hired as a sensory scientist in a major winery, I had this massive, embarrassing blind spot moment. I literally couldn't smell the dominant aroma in a red wine, while my colleagues were just all over it. I was literally nose blind to a major wine aroma, but I didn't lose my job, thankfully. Instead, I was able to follow a very structured sensory training to retrain my nose. Today, I'm going to show you exactly the same psychological and sensory frameworks that I use to overcome my weak nose, and you can use them to unlock your tasting confidence. Hi, I'm Isabelle Lesschaeve, your wine tasting coach. Let's go back in time for a moment. I'm a young sensory scientist starting my career in a major winery, and we start working on a red wine project. And we were tasting a batch of red wines, and all my colleagues were detecting this violet aroma. And I was just like, smelling my glass, nothing there. Smelling again, nothing there. I was very embarrassed. Imagine, they hired me when I was in France, brought me to California, and I was failing at a simple exercise that was to describe a red wine and couldn't pick up that violet aroma. So I was very embarrassed, and I realized it was a blind spot of mine, that maybe I was anosmic to this compound. But thankfully, my colleague, Leslie, who was a flavorist, said, no, Isabelle, hang on. I will help you, and I'm going to train you so that you can recognize violet the next time we have red wine to analyze. All right, so what she did was to ask me to come every morning for several weeks to her lab. And there she had set up a series of exercise, basically different solution of the beta-ionone compound, which is responsible for the violet aroma, for me to smell every day. She studied at higher concentration so that I can finally detect that violet aroma, and I could memorize it. And then slowly she decreased the concentration so that I could train my brain to start detecting those lower concentration. So I was not anosmic. I was able to detect the beta-ionone violet aroma, but I was not as sensitive as my colleague. I was hyposmic. And it's a blind spot that many of us have for different wine aroma compounds, and it's very trainable. And I was able the next time, to detect that aroma that my colleagues were experiencing. So this story, I hope, illustrates that with repeated exposure, having me smelling these violet aromas, every day for 2 weeks at different concentration, this repeated exposure to the aroma trained my brain to memorize this quality of aroma so that I could train my nose and my brain to be more comfortable and to be more discerning to identify this aroma in red wine. So you can train your brain with that intention to become more sensitive to particular wine aromas. So if you have a weak nose, it's possible to become more sensitive with a particular training. And it doesn't have to be in a lab, and I will tell you more in a minute. So it's possible to train your nose and overcome that weak nose phenomenon. As a sensory scientist, I've trained hundreds of people like you to become tasters. Not specifically wine tasters, I trained professional panels who were working on cheese, juice, coffee, you name it, fruits, but of course, wine. And during my experience, what I noticed is that some people have more abilities to perform better at tasting. What do I mean by perform better? a good taster, a good sensory panelist, a good sensory taster is someone who is able to discern many descriptors in a product, but reliably, consistently. So it's not that they have a huge vocabulary and pretend to detect something. No, every time we present the same product, they come up with the same description. So they are very consistent and reliable. So part of my work was to identify those tasters before they join in our research program, before I train them. And as I said, I realized that some people were more trainable than others. So I was curious, how can I identify those people ahead of time so that I work with really the people that have the best chance to be performing sensory tasters? Well, I decided to conduct my PhD research on that topic so that I could identify the qualities, the skills that future sensory panelists have. So what are the criteria that I should focus on to recruit the sensory panelists that have the best chance to perform as good tasters, meaning to be able to discern as many wine aromas, taste and mouthfeel and texture attributes reliably. So during that research, I, of course, looked at different sensory tests, different ways to measure sensibility of aromas, of taste, but also I looked at other tests that were more from the psychological background. And my results after training 7 different panels, so close to more than 100 people, I realized that there were 2 ingredients, 2 skills that were quite determinant in predicting the future performance of those sensory tasters. The first one was the ability to focus. I used a psychological test that was used to screen potential airline pilots who really need to focus all the time. It was kind of a fun test, very different. So it was timed. People had to cross different figures on a legal sheet of paper. It was kind of unusual, but the results of this test was a good predictor of the future performance of the panelists, which are, again, the ability to discern and be consistent in their sensory descriptions. So this ability to focus was critical. The second skill that I identify as critical for future performance was the ability to memorize aromas. And in wine, aromas are very important in your enjoyment, but also in your ability to describe the quality of a wine. So this test was really to understand if people had memorized aromas they were presented before. So the first week they were coming for that selection test, we would present about 15 different odors, aromas that were more or less familiar for the participant. And the second week, we blended 8 aromas that they have smelled the week before and 8 that were new. And the task was to answer the question, have you smelled this aroma last week? And the correct answers, the more the correct answers, the more skilled those people were to have memorized these aromas that they had smelled the week before. So this result was a good predictor for future performance. So these 2 skills, ability to focus and ability to memorize aromas, are not innate skills. They are skills that you develop, that you can learn to develop. You can improve your tasting skill by paying more attention to the scent surrounding you, to the task of tasting. I don't understand why people are talking while others are tasting. You really need to be focused and really present so that your senses can detect and you can interpret your perception. And you can improve your tasting skills also by by improving your aroma memorization, and you can practice that through sensory training. So these skills can be developed and acquired as well. The third story I want to share today is how being myself a panelist made me realize how I could better train my people in their tasting duties. One day I was asked to be part of a orange juice panel. Orange juice, you might say, very simple product. Well, not that simple, because when the juices are processed differently, when the fruits are coming from different origins, the sensory profiles of those orange juices can be very, very different. So I was in my sensory booth, and at first I was completely lost, because it's one thing to train people, but it's the other thing to be in their shoes. And that experience made me realize, how uncomfortable it can be to be a panelist, not knowing what you are tasting, not knowing what the goal of the tasting is, and knowing that I was going to be judged on my performances. So this was a typical blind tasting environment, and the goal was not to guess the orange variety or which orchard it was coming from, like those crazy blind tasting that the sommelier loves so much, where they challenge themselves to identify the grape varieties, in the wine, its origin, the vintage, and maybe the producer. No, the blind tasting we are talking about in sensory science is not knowing what you're tasting and letting your senses really figure out what the product has to express. What are the perceptions that you are having? And that's why it's very important as a sensory panelist to be very focused, very discerning, but also very reliable, because we want to rely on the tasting data to make future decisions. So here I was sitting in my tasting booth, and I was asked to describe those orange juices, to be as precise as possible, and also to give an perceived intensity of those descriptors that I was smelling and tasting. So it was a very vulnerable moment, knowing that I was going to be assessed on my performance. But what I realized in that booth was the importance of the sensory calibration. We describe by analogy of what we know. And during this experience as a sensory panelist, we used different products to benchmark our sensory description. So in orange juice, for example, you have different descriptors that could describe, the juicy character of the orange. It could be the pith of the skin, the zest of the orange. So we had different products to illustrate those aromas that we could find in those juices. So we were calibrating our sensory perceptions with those product benchmark. To measure intensity, we also calibrated our palate with solutions of different concentrations, or juices, diluted differently so that we can assess the mouthfeel, whether they were thin or thick. So the use of these product benchmarks are very useful to calibrate your nose, to calibrate your palate, so that you can be reliable and discerning in your task of describing a product. But smelling and tasting like that without any engagement from your part is not very useful. What I discovered through that process is that every time I was able to smell and taste a product reference, I would pause, smell, pause again, take notes, smell again, take notes, try to describe in my own words what this product reference made me think of. And it didn't have to be very, elaborate in it as a description, but it could remind me of a place, of a color, of a sensation, a feeling. And it helped me really memorize those different aromas. I said, aroma memorization is very important. This skill is very important for future tasting performance. And this act of calibrating my nose and my palate by paying attention through that sensory practice of smelling, taking notes, and memorizing was very critical in my ability to perform as a sensory panelist. So I've been in those shoes, and I really appreciate the importance of this exercise of sensory calibration. So as a wine taster, it's very important to calibrate your nose and your palate. And you need to do that very intentionally. And the best practice is to follow a structured sensory training. And really, you don't need to be in a sensory booth or in a lab to be able to train your nose and train your palate. I continue to use these principles of sensory practices every day. For example, every spring, I refresh my sensory repertoire of wildflowers. I'm lucky to live in the south of the US, where jasmine, gardenia, and magnolia are blooming at the same time. So my sensory practice is every day I go out in my neighborhood walking my dog, and every time I encounter jasmine, gardenia, or magnolia, I will pause, smell, refresh my memory about the scent, and continue my walk. This simple mindful smelling practice enabled me to have very clear representation of what these three wildflowers were, how distinct they were, and how I could differentiate them, possibly in a wine. And really, it doesn't take too much time. You just dedicate 15 to 20 minutes every day to this simple sensory practice of mindful smelling. And when you follow a more structured sensory program, it's the same thing. You follow the instructions of your sensory trainer, and it takes 15 to 20 minutes a day to do so. Tasting skills are skills that you can develop, but it takes consistent practice so that you can improve your focus, improve your ability to memorize those sensations and to record them during the tasting, and more importantly, to be consistent in your tasting notes. For 30 years, I trained professional sensory panels and sensory scientists. And, for the last 5 years, I've taken this exact same scientific framework, mindfulness, intentional focus, repeated exposure of the practice, and sensory calibration. And I open them up to wine enthusiasts and professionals just like you. And I continue to teach these principles in the Wine Tasting Confidence Accelerator. It's a small coaching program that I'm opening up for application. It's kind of an exclusive, very curated experience to improve your tasting skills and moving you from doubting yourself to being very confident about your skills. And I drop below the link to the application form. And if I think you could benefit from this training, I will invite you for a call where we can discuss your needs and make sure that this program will benefit you and we can work together. In the meantime, cheers.